Welcome back to my series on why the quality of things has absolutely failed us as of late, and how you can learn to look for better things. I've already talked about fabrics, so now we're moving on to clothing construction. In case you're new here, I've been in the clothing and sewing industry for more than 20 years, and I've worked in both manufacturing and product design, which means I have a lot of thoughts and useful information to cover. So buckle in for a hefty video. We'll be looking at the process of design, patterning, cutting, construction, and purchasing to know how those work and where the shortcuts end up. I unintentionally purchased three matching ensembles from three different companies that have drastically different qualities and construction. This linen set from Zara retailed at $150 total, this cotton set from TB Co. that retailed at $140 total, and this silk and rayon mix set from Cezanne that retailed at $370 total. By the end of this, we should have a much better idea of what is not worth those prices. Because it's not as simple as where it's made, how much it costs, what brand it is, or even what it's made from. Turns out, a lot of clothing companies know just what to say and show to convince us of quality. The internet is far from an honest place, which is why I'm so happy that the sponsor for today's video is Incogni. Incogni tracks down and removes your personal data from hundreds of websites. In just the last few months, they found over 800 places where my private information has been picked up by data brokers and sold repeatedly. Addresses, phone numbers, employers, financial info, even shopping habits have all been just handed around. As of now, nearly all of those cases have been successfully taken down just a few days after they pop up. And if I come across anything beyond their list of known problems, they have custom removals as well. With their unlimited family and family unlimited plans, you just submit a link where your information is being exposed, and they'll submit a request for you. It's not just about stopping those annoying fake calls and texts, though that definitely has improved. It really doesn't take much to piece together enough information to have your identity stolen or accounts opened under your info. It doesn't matter how much you actually willingly share online, every account, every order, every time you visit a website at this point, you hand over access to a little more information. There's just no way to keep up with how fast it spreads. Incogni actually has an estimated time saved ticker on your dashboard, and mine is already over 600 hours. There's no way that I could have handled all of that myself. Everything from your contacts to health, employment, demographics, and even family connections is regularly picked up and sold. So take back your personal data with Incogni. Go to incogni.com/NicoleRudolph and use code NicoleRudolph to get 60% off an annual plan. It may not feel like the style of your clothing has a lot to do with the quality, but the design process includes far more than just a quick sketch. Spec sheets, specification sheets mark out all of the tiniest details down to the size of the buttonholes. Every design is thought through, not just in terms of style, but in terms of how it should actually be made. Decisions about the entire process we're going to be covering are often made at this point. Now, things might change along the way. That is especially true when it comes to budget and adjusting cost. But this is where an idea becomes technical choices. What that means for our closets is that this is where textiles are chosen. So garment quality can go out the window before we even begin. A great example of this is the 2010s trend for cheap knit fabric on the back of tops instead of the actual fashionable fabric. Seam placement and darts can make a big difference on how picky the fit is, especially if the fabric isn't stretchy. Examples might be how the sleeves are attached or how fitted the style is. Something with tight sleeves and a standard armhole will fit a smaller range of shoulders. Raglan style or looser fit sleeves will be more forgiving to a range. That's not necessarily a quality-based decision, but can be directly impacted if small alterations are made down the line. A slightly smaller sleeve might save on a large amount of fabric, But what if it was already designed to be fitted? Now, it's not going to work for most bodies. Choosing proportions and measurements of add on pieces is another example. We've all tried on a pair of jeans where the back pockets were poorly placed and made for a depressed looking butt. Pockets that are too small. That should be something specified in this step. Adding on trims and extras, embroidery, or even choosing what type of drawstring goes into a hoodie or how the ends are finished off. Theoretically, design should be the point where every single decision gets made and written down in notes, from the size of the hem to the number of buttons to the way the garment is going to be constructed. This is one of the most variable parts of the process and the most influential. However, as we'll cover more at the end, who exactly is in charge of this part is so incredibly broad. There is not a standardized education or even a standardized version of a spec sheet. Students and classes are usually taught a variety of versions, which means some garment designs leave their creator with a great amount of thought and detail, while others are a few notes at best. And that's going to make a big difference on the rest of the process. Obviously, I don't know exactly how our three outfits were designed, but I can say that both the TB Co. and the Cezanne examples had very specific fabric choices. TB Co. is known for this type of stripe, and they have the same outfit in another color variation. So they probably spent a lot of time picking out this fabric or maybe even having it custom made. Cezanne specifically calls out that the fabric print designs are a collaboration with another artist and made for just the brand. So they definitely didn't shortcut that part of the design. They thought about it a lot. This process is considered the most complicated and skilled portion of the process, though modern programs are making it simpler, or at least seem simpler. Frankly, I do think that the use of these digital standards is producing some of the worst fitting stuff ever. Regardless of what process or program is being used, there are quite a few consistent things, one of which is the first version of the pattern being done in a small size, often the actual size small. From there, the pattern is graded up and down, almost entirely up, to different sizes. Not surprisingly, when making one or two adjustments down and four or way more adjustments upwards, things skew the further away from the original you get. Some parts need to get bigger and change shape, while other measurements may barely increase or not at all. Manufacturers also have a range of standard sizes or body blocks, an extremely simple version of a fitted garment that you can build over and out. There is not a universal standard. Frankly, there is barely one for any single company beyond a moderate size. I've done a few videos on how that mess happened, but patterning's main goal is to produce a sample version in that smaller size, which is as close to the design as possible. Everything needs to then line up and match. Pieces that seam together, having the same length, pockets are stitched on in the right place, all of the details are noted, marked, etc. There is then a standard of how things get sized up or down to keep that appearance the same. Hence, sleeves not only change width, but length as well. Decorative parts, pockets, and details might also size up or down to keep proportion. Obviously, something like a waistband gets longer as sizes go up, but does it also get wider? Does the pocket opening in a pair of pants change sizes? What about a cuff or a collar? What might be proportional for a size small might be far off, just a few steps away. That's why plus size is generally considered to be its own size chart and requires a totally new pattern for that grouping, sort of resetting the proportions. What this means for you is that the fast and cheap method of patterning doesn't really account for size changes all that much. If you see subtle changes between each size to keep proportions appropriate, that may be a hint that more effort went into that part of the process. I especially love when companies show models of at least two sizes for this reason. You can actually see how things were adjusted. The size of the cuff, a patch pocket, the number of buttons down the front of a shirt. All things that may show a little more consciousness of how the garment actually works on the body. Now, this does not guarantee that a size small will actually fit, frankly, anyone. Ideally, before production, samples in at least two sizes are made up of the correct fabric, though. This, however, for long distance production, is time consuming and costly. Samples allow for minor changes to be made, adjusting the size of the buttons on a shirt so you don't get gaps across the chest, making sure that pleat doesn't fall weird when on a real body, that the sleeves allow the arms to actually lift, or that strap doesn't keep falling off the shoulder. Bodies are too complex and too variable to guarantee the perfect fit of a new style without tests. But for cost and time, that is one of the first things that gets cut. The armhole, or what is termed the armscye in sewing, is one of the biggest victims of patterning shortcuts. A loose body puts the hole low and large so that there's enough room to lift the arm, but that also requires a large sleeve. Make it a tight sleeve, and that arm is now actually stuck down low. The most movement comes from a fitted body where the armhole can be high up, and a sleeve that least has some extra around the shoulder. But if this either isn't accounted for in design nor adjusted for in patterning, especially when it comes to saving fabric or not double checking how parts interact, movement will not only be uncomfortable, but it usually sits oddly on the body as well. Comparing the two sleeved examples. Starting with Cezanne, that fits over my shoulders well and allows for at least some movement. The body is not super tight, so there will be a little bit of pull if I lift far, but nothing feels like it's stuck there. No oddly short sleeves when I move, and I can reach forward. It doesn't bunch anywhere around the armholes either. The Zara example is another story. The armhole is set pretty far out on the shoulder, but the sleeve is too narrow at the top. That means that there isn't enough room to lift my arm at all. And yet it looks like it's slumping off of me because the sleeve is forcing it to go that far. The body is plenty roomy, but the widths across the back and front are narrow, and it feels like I can't close comfortably. So the basic measurements of bust, waist, and arm are probably fine. No one checked how this fits on a body with real arms that needs to move. Reasons I wish brands would give you more photographs of the clothing being worn, not just standing straight or heavily styled on a really slender model. This is where cost cutting also really picks up. To spend a couple of hours more on a design and samples is one thing. To spend a few minutes more on each one of thousands of items is another. The standard of mass production cutting has long been to stack the fabric high and cut out dozens at a time. The trick is to cut fast and waste as little as possible. What this leads to is variation between garments. What is cut out on top of the stack and what is on the bottom may vary by an inch or more with just a slight angle of the saw. Hence, you can try on the same style in the same size and find that things like jeans, which don't stretch, may not fit. This conservation of every bit of fabric also leads to less than ideal choices. Some are obvious, like smaller pockets. An inch or two per pocket seems small, but multiply that times the thousands of that style, even hundreds. Other choices aren't as obvious, like grain line. I've talked about this in the first video of the series on fabric quality, but the quick version is that fabric has different properties on the straight lines going the long or short way across the fabric than on the diagonal, the bias. So a plain weave cotton, like a shirt, may not stretch on the straight, but give a little on the bias. Knits may stretch far more across the weft than on the long direction of the warp. A great example are the bias cut dresses that are meant to cling and flow. This means that certain shapes are meant to be straight or bias. The front of a shirt should be straight. We don't want the buttonholes and plackets stretching out. That would cause gapping. But the shoulders are given a little bit more forgiveness by having that diagonal sit where we move all the time. Older style garments, 18th and 19th century especially, love to have a little bend in the sleeve that would put the bias at the forearm. That and our arms aren't usually perfectly straight. We kind of bend them a little all the time. But this shape is less convenient to nest with others when cutting out. So we simplify to save fabric, and that means it doesn't fit as well or stretch as easily. Poorly cut garments may have their straight grain all over the place because of careless cutting. Necklines will stretch out in the wrong places, hems may settle to be very uneven, anything that requires precise cutting, like matching stripes or prints, is going to take more time and more fabric. Having multiple fabrics can also be either a very good or a very bad thing. Cheap things chosen for less obvious areas, like flimsy backs on shirts or bad linings, is done to save money in places that won't matter as much. But choosing more stable and sturdy fabrics for pockets and waistband facings or contrast piping and trim is more expensive. Note that some fabrics are plenty sturdy enough on their own to be pockets, and that means the opening also won't show as much. All three of the examples have a printed or woven pattern so we can see things a little more clearly. Sazan does not get so detailed as to pattern match, meaning something like the side seams continue the pattern perfectly, which is not always possible and certainly not practical, but we can see that they take the time to make sure the fabric is on grain. The hem curves, but in the center back it's clearly straight. The stripes are also extremely close to perfect. They're very small, and it's very difficult at that scale. And there are some slight curves in the pattern that make it look like it goes off, but it's really just a curve. Even the waist tie only varies by about a quarter of an inch the whole length. TB Co. has a much wider stripe, and they do attempt to center them up and keep them straight to the edges. Again, not absolutely perfect, but the effort is clearly there. It's extra clear on the facings, which do match up with their stripes on the outside. The accents on the pants are done with horizontal stripes, both a design choice, and it makes it easier to not have to match things up when cutting out dozens. The backs also match up so there's no weird stuff happening there. Lots of good design as well as patterning and cutting. The Zara stripe is going to be the most forgiving in size and color contrast. It's not terribly obvious. Pants also match up on the back just fine, though I would prefer the stripe to not be offset on the visible pocket opening in front. The front edges of the jacket, however, are pretty far off grain in varying ways, so not consistently the same choice. Not enough to affect the fit, thankfully, but it does point to it being cut out in a stack or with a lot less care. Every garment is made by hand, as in there is a person guiding that garment through sewing machines. Very few things are made with hand stitching, meaning that no machines are involved. But even if every seam is done by a person on a machine, they are not all equal. And it's not just a matter of quality when it comes to trimming the tails off the ends of threads or keeping straight lines or backstitching to make sure things don't start to rip open. Not only does every seam get stitched, it also gets finished. Raw, cut edges of fabric will fray apart, especially in the wash. The fastest way to do this is with a serger. This not only serges the edges, a complex 3 or 4 thread looping over the edge to hold it together, but also stitching a seam next to that. So 2 or more layers get finished together at the same time. One pass, everything is done. It's going to be a little more lumpy from the outside, rougher from the inside, more likely to fail, and much harder to alter. The exception to this is in knits. This makes a stretchy finish, which is needed for knits. If you use a regular stitch on a regular sewing machine, it will break when stretched. There are alternatives, but it's complicated. One of my more expensive t-shirts actually has a strip of folded fabric stitched over the shoulder seams to keep that serged area from rubbing or laying wonky. The next level of seams is to serge each piece separately and then seam them up, or to fold the seam allowance over and top stitch it for strength, like jeans do, or even to stitch the seam together and then serge it. There's also more invisible options like French seams, where the raw edges get sort of folded inside of themselves. That's great for sheers and lightweight fabrics where you wouldn't want to see the serging or where the fabric might be too fragile to hold it. Binding or taping is another range of extra work to finish things off as well. The outside edges have just as many ways to finish as the ones inside. Most often you'll see one of three versions. Fold it and stitch it down, fold another fabric around it and bind it, or do a facing or lining to hide it. None of these are better than the others, but all have easy and hard modes. Folding twice and stitching is a nice hem for something like a shirt. Folding up once is common for pants and skirt hems, so they lay flat. There's usually still serging or something else on the raw edge in that case. The shortcut here is how it gets stitched down. The most popular is a hemming machine that has a curved needle to make an invisible, nearly, stitch on the outside. The problem is that it's one thread, not two like a regular seam, so if it snags and breaks, the whole thing just rips out, hence hems fail a lot. You'll rarely see anything other than that or visible regular stitching, however. Binding seems less common, but the method is everywhere. Two pieces, or a folded piece of fabric, essentially bites down on a raw edge. It's the same method used for cuffs and collars, or for plackets down the front of a shirt, or where there's an added opening like a sleeve. Waistbands as well. The nice way makes sure everything is lined up and top stitched. Hand stitching to finish is also an invisible option, but again, rare. The faster way is to stitch one side on, fold it over with the raw edge out, and top stitch it all down. Then you don't have to worry about lining up the folded edge underneath. Facings and linings are pretty much standard for more structured garments as well as anything that has folded back lapels. The bigger issue with facings is that they attach around that outside edge, but then need their inside edge attached somewhere as well. Otherwise, it can just keep flopping up or out. Quick method is a couple of machine tacks at places like side seams or pockets, shoulders. Top stitching can also be made part of the design. Hand stitching or using that hem machine or invisible stitch can also be used, but is rare. It's a well thought out design that thinks about how the facing will actually be handled in the final version when worn. The biggest concern with linings, outside of the type of fabric they're made from, is if they fit. Too big and they'll hang out of the bottom or bunch up in places like the armholes. Too small and they'll cause the outside to look baggy and wrinkled. It's not just a matter of patterning and cutting to fit. There are lots of tricks to prevent future issues. They just take more time. A pleat at the center back, a hem in a jacket that folds down just a little, any place where some bit of ease is added, not just because the fabrics may shrink or grow when washed, as things like suit jackets aren't washed, but because lining fabrics often don't stretch quite as much as outer fabrics, and you don't want to blow out seams when you reach for a glass of water. Which also brings us to the most stressed area of the garment, the armhole. But even in unlined garments, a little bit of extra reinforcement goes a long way. Shirts more often will have the seam folded over and stitched down. It's called felling on a curve that is very fidgety and takes skill, so again, a good tell for a bit of extra effort. None of the examples are fully lined, but they all have different methods of using facings and various seam constructions. Cezanne uses French seams on the top, and while they do serge the seams together on the pants, they're actually seamed first to make things more precise and reinforced. There's also a small strip of iron-on interfacing that is added to the seam for strength. The waistband is faced with Petersham ribbon to keep it stable and prevent crumpling. Facings on the jacket are designed in a way that allows them to be fully stitched down. The understitching along the front edge, which is to keep it from rolling back and forth, switches sides based on which part will be visible. Most notable, only because this is a specific point in one of the classes that I teach, the darts in the pants are tied off with a knot rather than backstitched with the machine. To quickly compare, TB Co. uses a backstitch here. Also fairly clean construction, but faster. Most of their seams are serged but stitched first. However, and this was exciting to find because it's not common in modern clothing, the seams on the pants are folded, stitched, and then serged. What this means is 4 layers of fabric to make the seam rather than just two, which is much stronger. I honestly have only ever seen this in 18th century men's breeches previously. It's amazing. Facings on the top are all understitched and then top stitched to keep them flat, while the front edge uses a bit of bias tape made from the same fabric. Zara's pants just use the serged seam, as I learned the first day I wore them and a hole opened up in my inseam, where one of the fabrics wasn't caught by the stitching at all. The top does have French seams on the side, but the sleeves are also done the fast way, and a few areas weren't lined up there either. That entire facing is loose, except for a small tack at the shoulders, and frankly, it's as narrow as can be in order to cover. If we flip it up, there is interfacing added for stability to the facing, but the edges inside are raw, which won't be visible, but will fray if washed. The understitching is also done entirely on one side, so it will be visible with the lapel folded back. All of that is overshadowed by just how rough the quality of stitching is with loose ends, wavering lines, and messy overlaps and corners. It's important to note here that this is because most people in the industry sewing these things are paid by the piece or set to a certain standard of how much has to be made in a certain amount of time. And they have to keep up to that standard. If they are running too slow, they get let go, they get fired, they get penalized, they earn less money. So, yeah, it's a good sign that somebody's getting paid very little to work really, really hard. I'm putting trims, pockets, buttons, and the whole range of extras in its own construction section because they vary so wildly. While the addition of anything obviously takes more time and supplies, there are plenty of high impact and low effort options. Embroidery designs are done by fairly automated machines before the fabric is even cut. It's a bigger tell if the embroidery is lined up near the edges, stays straight, doesn't have big scratchy patch of interfacing on the inside. That means someone actually thought about placement and wear rather than just vibes. Other decor, like piping or braid, soutache, passementerie, or whichever term, also needs the same consideration. Stiff or heavy cords are a poor choice on a thin t-shirt jersey knit. Beading and sequins can be hand sewn to the garment after construction or can be woven into the fabric. Obviously, the first way is far more expensive. If you see something where the sequins are stitched into the seams and don't fall cleanly around the edges, that's a sign that they skipped the step of removing the bulk from the stitching areas first. Cutting corners by not cutting stuff that will now be inside your garment and scratching you. Pockets are both practical and decorative. Patch pockets are the simplest. Many pants have pockets either set into the seams or cut across at an angle. Neither way is difficult, but the angle is less likely to gap if things fit a little too snug around the hips. Look for under or top stitching in this area to make sure it doesn't roll, as well as little facings on the pocket bags if they aren't the same fabric. Otherwise, that may be flashing out when worn, or especially when sitting. The most difficult pocket type to construct is usually welted. This way is more common in tailored styles, but you also see it in the back of pants pretty commonly. There are so many ways to do welts, some of which are still pretty fast, but the ends can get messy in all versions, so double check how clean that actually looks. Which goes for all pockets. The corners or ends are going to be under a lot of stress. A few extra stitches in a little box or across the join can help prevent things from coming apart. Other high stress areas to watch out for are closures, zippers, buttons, snaps, and hooks. Zippers can be invisible, where they hide in a seam, or visible, or hidden under a placket. They can separate at the bottom, like coats, or have a stop, like pants usually do. They should have a secondary closure at the top if they are stressed. So, pants will normally have either a waistband that buttons or hooks or something, like a dress back will have a small hook. It's to keep it from being pulled apart. Metal zippers are far more sturdy than nylon, but can be rough or stiff. Nylon does come in a range of sizes, and the smaller the teeth, the more likely that you'll be able to pull it open from the middle. YKK is considered the standard brand for quality, and you'll see the logo on their pull. Snaps and hooks are sometimes attached with prongs and backs, while others are hand sewn on or done with shortcuts using a machine zigzag. So long as the stitching looks sturdy and doesn't have a bunch of those loose ends sticking out, it should be okay. Make sure that the stitching either doesn't go through to the outside if it's supposed to be invisible, or goes through enough layers to not pull weird if it's supposed to be stressed like a waistband. Buttons follow similar rules. The biggest problem there is that machines are used to stitch them on, which means that the end is just left loose. No knots or other way to anchor the end of the thread. Hence, they get a tug on the end and can just start unraveling. Not that hand sewn buttons are a perfect guarantee. Some buttons have very rough edges and will cut through thread in time. That's especially true with metal. Hence, heavyweight metal buttons are not usually stitched but attached with prongs and backings. While the Cezanne set uses coordinating fabrics for trim and facings, it does have a hidden zipper and buttons. The top uses fabric covered buttons that were custom made and hand stitched on. Inside of the pants, the hidden zipper is actually bound around the edges so it's less rough. I can honestly say I've rarely seen that effort. TB Co. has a few areas of necessary effort, like extra rows of stitching on elastic waistbands so the elastic doesn't twist or curl within that tube. The ties are either inserted into a seam or tacked down twice, though I would prefer a little square of like an extra layer of fabric to reinforce behind that. The welted pockets will be sturdier than the inseam style, no stress on the seam itself. However, the welt is done one of the ways where you get some rough clips in the corners showing. The welt is essentially inserted into the opening rather than around the now raw edges. Zara also has a couple extra rows of stitching on the elastic waist, and the inside edge is at least bound instead of just being serged. Granted, there was clearly something wrong with the machine at the time, so the stitching is not in great shape and will probably start to fail before long. The pocket is made from a tighter weave cotton with added patches of the linen to keep it from being visible. The edges are just serged and stitched down and not folded over, however, so it's going to get a lot of wear and tear by your hands. The effort made to keep the tops pockets from crumpling with the strap connecting to the facing and the little corner cutout to reduce bulk are good extras, but attaching to such a loose facing doesn't really do much. The most difficult part of determining quality comes from the fact that all of these parts of the process are nearly always different hands, different buildings, and often different companies entirely, definitely different countries. The more a business scales up, the less they can keep to just one location or one manufacturer. There are thousands in some of the major production cities around the world, so choice is broad. Even when I was working in the shoe industry, we'll cover that another time, women's shoes with heels were made in entirely different locations from flats, sneakers, or even sandals. We had to vet each manufacturer and their abilities. If we didn't, the manufacturer that we were currently working with and asked to do something that they didn't know how to do would find someone, hopefully someone good. Even if the designer has great care and skill, that doesn't mean that shortcuts aren't taken by others along the way. Fabric can be swapped out for budget or because it's no longer available. Cutting might be adjusted slightly to take up less fabric. Speed might win out over precision. The samples that came back might end up being completely different than the finished product. I've seen that quite a few times. Hence, most companies pay for quality checks to be done, but that's a multi step process if you want it done right. You can't just check how many are in the boxes and pull out an example or two. It's easy to put the nice ones on top. You have to check the whole way through the process. And even if it's caught at the end stage, by then it's too late. It's either deal with the changes that were made or delay for weeks or even months, cancel the product altogether. The process of going from design to finished product usually takes 6 months to a year. Yes, some happen faster when things like dupes are part of the mix, but that's one garment, not a whole store or whole season. Add on that many large companies don't even make all of their own stock. Large shows like Magic are for buyers and manufacturers. Department stores aren't very secretive about the fact that their stock is made up of a jumble of brands that produce their own lines, but don't always have a storefront. Same thing on Amazon, where countless brands sell widely varying qualities. Some are surprisingly good, others horrible. However, it's not just them. Look at a large brand like Anthropology. They do have labels on a lot of their garments online that tell you which smaller business the clothing was actually designed and produced by. However, the vast majority of unlabeled things are likely also coming from outside of Anthro. Their titled line, Maeve, is probably the only one that we know is truly in house. Even then, the jeans are probably coming from a different manufacturing side than dresses or shirts, t shirts. Sometimes patterning happens with the label company, but it's also common for that to be part of each individual manufacturer, which means that the quality, size, and standards may not be consistent even across one brand. Add in that every season different fabrics will stop being available, many of manufacturers have massive turnover, and various impacts of things like tariffs might shift production locations. The larger a company is, the less consistent it can be. There's also some added irony in that many manufacturers work for multiple brands, and you can have a $1,000 dress being made by the same people as a $50 one. That's also why prices can vary so much and have barely anything to do with quality. Fabric and supplies are, of course, a huge part of the cost, but that gets cut down when doing wholesale. The more of the fabric purchased, the less it costs per yard, the less it costs in terms of time, shopping, and shipping as well. Smaller companies can't buy as much. Manufacturers that sell to brands later can get great deals based on what's available. Make a ton of things out of that fabric they can get a lot of cheaply, and keep the cost down enough that the final product is still relatively cheap on the rack. But every cost adds up quickly, even if it is only pennies. Many people get paid for their work even before we reach the stitchers, who are often paid some of the lowest amounts. Shipping, both the packing materials and the actual cost of shipping, plus tariffs, plus fees for going through customs, better hope it's not delayed to search more, they charge you for that too, then shipped from port to warehouse, then out to stores, then out to customers, is a lot to account for. That doesn't even consider that return rates are extraordinarily high, 20 to 40% average for online purchases, and that goes upwards the cheaper the clothing is. Fast fashion, more like 50%. However, it's no shock that companies put a ton of markup on things if they can. A brand name that people associate with quality, luxury, or exclusivity, or just trends, can up prices 10 times over actual cost. If I'm going to spend more money on a garment, I try to stick to smaller companies first for that reason. At least I'm not paying for a board member's salary or even just tons of advertising. But a certain brand name doesn't always mean quality, nor does it always mean something is trash. Prices on certain garments will be raised because they can, while others stay low because they're considered loss leaders, things that get you in the door on the website because they're cheap. I know this is where something like a list of recommended companies would come in, but frankly, that's both a very long list and an ever changing one. Everlane. Go buy it now while it's still good. Companies appear, disappear, get sold to private equity, or have any number of other issues. I've put a short list in the description of some smaller brands that I personally have experience with, but feel free to add your own positive experiences in the comments. For now, though, I think it's pretty clear where my examples fall in the scale of quality. This linen set from a fast fashion company is nowhere near quality to cost ratio. I'll be repairing the seams, stitching down the facing, and completely taking off and recutting the sleeves to make it work. It would start falling apart in the first wash. Yes, I bought this because I liked the fabric and wanted something quick. I regret that, but I'm going to make it work. TB Co. is by far the best buy of the group. I have some pajamas from them as well, and we'll be buying more things in the future. It is cotton versus linen, so that does help keep the cost down a little bit, but production quality and fit is great. Cezanne is obviously the investment piece. The fabric is a big part of the cost since it's a custom printed one on a more expensive textile, but the construction is also tedious and precise compared to the other methods. Also, TBCO is out of the UK and Cezanne is out of France, so I was paying extra on top of those because of the tariffs. So costs may be different in your area. But these are all great examples of how price alone doesn't tell you much, but also how quality doesn't always have to mean the highest price. Simple styles with well thought out construction techniques can be the better bet if you're on a budget. All in all, there's no one magic green flag, or, well, there are a lot of red flags for clothing and quality, but hopefully, by looking for some of the clues, some of the hints that more time and effort went into this thing, comparison to how much they're charging, especially when it comes to brands that really rely on having a good reputation, that can mean a lot. And the same thing goes for honestly any product. I will be continuing the series. I think the next one will probably be talking about shoes because that is something I'm familiar with. But it goes for every single type of item you have to purchase. Larger brands who don't really care about reputation because they're selling in large quantity, and really flashy, colorful, fun things aren't always as good a quality as the plain, simple things sold by brands that have a much more limited range. At least that's been my experience.